Guys, it's our last lecture. And I wanted to say what a privilege it's been to work with you all this summer. I've thoroughly enjoyed even our limited interactions. I've missed getting to interact with you guys in person, which is what I'm accustomed to. But please continue to use me as a resource as you take these master's degrees and move on to bigger and better things, or even if you stick with your current careers and continue to do the great work you're doing. So thanks for being such exceptional students. I can tell how much many of you have invested in this course, and it's really been delightful to get to read your work and hear your stories. So with that, we are going to talk a little bit about wildlife management in the modern world. Your book just had some really cursory sort of questions and thoughts about where wildlife management might move in the future. What are some of the current debates and ethical questions surrounding modern techniques? So this is really all I pulled from the book for this lecture, just some of the questions and themes to ponder. Should wildlife species be reintroduced to former habitat? The book goes into an interesting example of a population that seems to have naturally disappeared from an area and the debate about whether or not to reintroduce the species there. Questions of species translocation versus allowing for natural migration of species, particularly in regards to climate change. Questions of embryo transplantation and cloning, ethical considerations around that, and the larger question of do we create and sustain populations of wildlife when we don't have natural habitats to support those? Should extinct animals be resurrected? It's just fascinating and complicated to think about. There's currently research on woolly mammoths and passenger pigeons, both well underway. This de-extinction effort is not a cloning exercise, but a gene editing exercise where once we've mapped the genetic information of a species, we can edit the DNA of closely related species and end up with organisms that are very, very similar to those extinct animals. And questions around captive breeding. Should species be captive bred and maintained in zoos in hopes that habitat may one day be available for these species and allow for their release and repopulation of areas? So a lot of questions really about humans playing God when it comes to maintaining threatened populations. The book mentioned a little bit about climate change and connectivity, about the work of the Wildlands Network. So I've decided for this last lecture to present a bit of a case study, some of the work I've been part of, which is spatial planning for climate adaptation, and specifically working with conservation groups on how to prioritize certain habitats that are going to allow species and biodiversity to persist into the future. So we're going to talk a good bit today about a new tool that the Nature Conservancy developed, and we'll talk both about what we would refer to as local resilience and regional resilience for biodiversity. So years ago, the Nature Conservancy undertook just a major science research project to map the locations of climate resilient sites. And they assembled a team of scientists that contributed to this broad mapping and modeling effort. They mapped bedrock and soil diversity across the landscape. Now we've got this data for across the entire US. That, of course, is the underpinning of all patterns of biodiversity. They looked at topographic diversity and connectedness, the lack of fragmentation on the habitat, or where do we have connected natural habitats. And the result was combined into an index that identifies the places that are more likely to sustain diversity into the future because they offer a wide range of climatic options within a connected area. So let's go into that a little bit. The scientists behind this, Mark Anderson, had written a paper, and there were others thinking along the same lines, that in light of a changing climate, what we should be focusing on more so than individual species conservation is having broad, intact natural habitats that are going to allow species to reassemble, shift, reorient with the changing climate as those habitats shift and change with time. And so the concept of this was a preserve the stage, but not the actors approach, which is an important concept to think about. So this concept of conserve the stage, one of the underpinnings of this is that we have a pretty good understanding of where we find species diversity, where we find biodiversity across the landscape. We know that that is usually predicted by geology types. Certain geology types foster more biodiversity. Limestone is correlated with biodiversity. Latitude, elevational range, all of these are predictors. And so these are also very mappable features in a landscape. When we look at to what extent we have conserved the stage, we recognize that there are different stages out there. There are different habitat types that support different types of actors, and they are not proportionately conserved across the landscape. So this is a really interesting breakdown of what percentage of different habitat features or types that we see in protection versus developed or in already converted to agriculture. And not surprisingly, that those areas that are productive, fertile, more moderate, best for human habitation or growing crops or fostering livestock, have been highly modified, and we have a very small percentage of those in any protected form. As we look down the line here, it's the areas with acidic soils, high elevation, high gradients, steep slopes, subalpine, high ridges, and alpine that we have protected the most of. So those places that are less valuable to humans, that are steep, harsh, acidic, and difficult to access are what we usually see most of the protection happening. So that, just in a snapshot, gives us some direction on the types of places we should be thinking about conserving in the future if we want to conserve multiple stages to protect diversity of plants and animals. So, as Mark Anderson often puts it, we protected a lot of rock and ice. In the southeastern United States, I actually see that often we have protected a lot of wetlands, forested wetlands and other freshwater wetlands that have sort of limited use for less use for agriculture, less use for human development. We have a higher percentage of those in protection as well. So what are some of the characteristics of a climate resilient site? We'll look at these one at a time. Physical diversity in the landscape. This is seeing different topography. It includes geology, soils, the elevation, various landforms, and water features all come together to create the physical diversity of a given landscape. Landform diversity describes the range of landforms and variation in temperatures and moistures, and this creates diversity for the local environment, what we might call microclimates. So there are more than 15 ecologically distinct landforms. The specific amount of landform diversity is relative in each geologic setting. And then geologic diversity is comprised of a broad range of geology and elevation combinations within a landscape that creates the conditions that foster unique ecosystems that certain species are adapted to. And this allows for an inventory of represented and underrepresented geophysical settings. What we mean by represented and underrepresented is whether or not they're represented within the conservation portfolio, within the places that we see protected. And then the other thing we look for in this analysis is local connectedness. Where do we see connectedness on the landscape that allows organisms to move and shift locally? And this is a really important concept because I think we think a lot about habitat migration, species migration, kind of on large scale latitudinal terms, but this local connectedness is actually just as or more important for fostering biodiversity. So where do we have options for species movements within an area that reflects continuity of intact natural cover and gives organisms access to several different microclimates and habitat types that might suit their needs during either long-term or even shorter-term climatic shifts. And then we'll talk more about regional connectivity. The concept of regional connectivity is more about those large-scale shifts, those major shifts that we might see over time that allow species movement between regions and areas, and it can indicate the potential for movement across latitudes and also up elevation gradients. And then the last factor is actually one of the hardest to model because we don't have any single database that gives us a good sense of the current biological condition of areas, across a huge geographic expanse. So we wanted one data set that we could map that tells us, gosh, what's the condition? How many species are present here, and what's the condition of those populations? Are they healthy? That's something we've had to use various proxies to understand. So, but in general, we do know that the biological condition, the current condition, is going to be an important predictor of the future biodiversity of an area as well. So that describes the level of stress or degradation of habitats in a given site. And condition is generally determined by the impact of development, past historic human uses, and climate change. So in putting all this together, the definition of a resilient site is able to recover from disturbances and requires fewer interventions over time. And this strength comes from two factors. One, the land's physical features that we described, including the geology and the landforms, and also its biological features, such as existing plants and animals, and then also its connectedness to allow for movements within natural habitats. So when this is modeled, we really look at landscape diversity, and we add to that local connectivity, and those two together create a climate resilience score for the landscape. So that climate resilience data set measures options for movement and microclimates in 62 geophysical settings at a 30-meter resolution. It includes terrestrial and wetland systems. The geodiversity is captured by stratifying the data by geophysical settings. Landscape diversity measures landforms for 100-acre regions surrounding each site and provides some statistics that provide a score for landscape diversity. And then local connectedness is measured by assessing the type and spatial arrangement of barriers that would be encountered when an organism is trying to move within a given site. So it measures ability to access resources on the landscape. So here again is the slide showing landscape diversity and microclimatic buffering that we might see. And this slide shows the final result of this modeling for the eastern US. So the darker green areas on the map are where the analysis designated as more resilient. And the light green areas are also considered resilient. Areas in yellow on this map have really, on the map on the right, were under analysis. So this data you can access online to play with it and really even scale it down to your given geographies and look at what are the areas that the tool designates as the most resilient to climate. And again, it helps to guide land protection efforts if we want to invest in places that we think might be the most important for preserving biodiversity in the near term. So I want to shift to regional connectivity, but I think I'm going to go ahead and end this lecture and then we'll keep going.